Namaste. We move forward with our discussion of the ecology of changes, and today we will have a look at the impacts of climate change. Now, climate change has become a hot currency these days, so we see people talking everywhere about climate changes. The question is, how does climate change impact the ecosystems, or what is its relation with ecology? Now, we have seen earlier that for any disturbance, climate change is also another disturbance. So, for any disturbance we can say that the impacts would depend on the size of that disturbance, the frequency of that disturbance or how commonly that disturbance occurs, and the initial state of the ecosystem. So, for instance, we saw that if there is a community that is normal, you give it a single large disturbance and you have the state that this community has moved from a normal state to an altered state, but then slowly and steadily it is trying to move back and then is able to reach the normal state once again. On the other hand, if you give multiple disturbances to this community, so in the first case it became an altered community, it was trying to recuperate back, but then you gave it another disturbance and now it is not able to cope up any further. Or the third case that we saw was the case of a community that is already stressed, and if you have this stressed community, you give it a disturbance and it is not able to recuperate back. Now, when we are talking about climate change is also a disturbance, and in certain instances we can call that it is a large disturbance, but in most cases a number of communities feel that the climate change is more of a stressor, because it is acting not abruptly as in the case of a forest fire or as in the case of an oil spill, but it is acting gradually. So, this is one of the stressors that a community might feel. So, climate change might be responsible to bring a community at this stage, and at this stage when the community is already stressed, so any disturbance would bring it to an altered state and it will not be able to recuperate back. So, we will look at climate change in more detail in the current lecture, and we will see what are the impacts that it is causing on ecology. So, we begin as always with the definitions. So, climate is defined as a broad composite of average conditions of a region measured in terms of things such as temperature, amount of rainfall or snowfall, snow and ice cover, and winds. So, climate is a composite of average conditions of a region. So, climate is not something that changes every day, it is a broad average. This broad average, the classical period of taking the averages is 30 years. So, over a 30-year period, if we ask that in the month of August what is the climate of Kanpur for instance, so we will come up with a figure that over the past 30 years in every month of August what was the amount of heat, or what was the temperature, what was the rainfall, did we have any snowfall, what was the wind direction, what was the wind speed, and so on. And when we come up with this average, we say that that is the climate of that particular region. Now, climate is governed by 5 components. So, these are the 5 components that govern the climate on the planet. So, the first component is ocean. If you have an area that is close to a big water body, that is close to an ocean, so it will have an equitable climate. The climate will not show a very large amount of variations. The summers will not be very hot, the winters will not be very cold. So, oceans play a major role in the climatic system. The second one is land. If you have an area that is in the interiors, so you will have a very great amount of climatic variations. The summers will be very hot, the winters will be very cold, and so on. And then both of these components act together. So, if you have a lot of heating on the land, so that would create an area of low pressure over the land, and if because the oceans do not show that great a level of heating, so there would be a high pressure on the oceans, and then you will have a wind that starts flowing from the ocean to the land. So, atmosphere is also another big component, because these two are acting together along with the atmosphere to result in winds in the system. Now, along with the atmosphere you have vegetation. Vegetation also plays a big role in the climate of a region. So, if you have an area that is full of plants, so the summers will not be that hot, And the fifth component is the ice cover that is present in an area. Now, if you have an area that has an ice cover, say the polar caps, so in that area when the sun shines, most of the energy of the sun gets reflected back, or in technical terms we say that the albedo of the area is very high. Most of the energy gets reflected back. So, the amount of heating that we will have in that area will be less. Now, when you have all 5 of these components, they form components of the climate system, and then they form the climate system through their interactions. So, we will have the hydrosphere that is interacting with the lithosphere, with the atmosphere, with the biosphere, and with the cryosphere. And similarly, all of these components will be interacting with each other. And when you have a combination of all 5 of these that are acting together, we say that this is forming a climate system. And when we talk about climate change, then there is a change in the climate of a particular region. So, climate change refers to a statistically significant variation in either the mean state of the climate or its variability. So, when we say the mean state of a climate, it means that earlier we were observing that in April Kanpur was not having a very high temperature, but now we are observing for the past few years that the temperature has shot up. So, the mean state of the climate would say that the mean temperatures of Kanpur in the month of April have gone up, and that if that is a statistically significant variation, then we would say that this area is showing the symptoms of a climate change. So, that is the mean state or its variability. Now, when we say variability, the question that we are asking is how many days do we have rainfall and how many days are the dry days. If we see a difference that more number of days are becoming rainier or more number of days are becoming drier days, then we would say that there is a change in the variability. Or earlier, suppose we were having a cycle in which every 10th year we were seeing a major drought in the area, and now we are seeing that every 3rd year we are seeing a major drought in the area. So, the variability of the climate has increased. Earlier, for roughly around 10 years the climate was stable and we were having a perturbation once every 10 years. Now, we are having a perturbation once every 3 years. So, we say that the variability of the climate has increased. So, that is also a climate change. So, climate change refers to a statistically significant variation in either the mean state of the climate or in its variability, persisting for an extended period, typically decades or longer. So, we cannot say that suppose this year in the month of April the temperature shot up, so that is climate change. No, because this is climate in itself means an averaging out over a long period, typically 30 years. So, when we talk about climate change, this also has to persist for an extended period, typically decades or longer. Now, climate change may be due to natural internal processes or external forcings. So, it might be because of some natural processes such as changes in the intensity or the amount of energy that is given out by the sun. Now, that is a natural process, or it could be because of some external forcings, or to persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of the atmosphere or in land use. So, anthropogenic changes are man-made changes. So, you can have natural internal processes, external forcings, or persistent anthropogenic changes, and all of these can together give rise to, or all of these can individually give rise to a climate change. So, when we say the working of the climate system, it means that you have this climatic system with all these 5 different components and you are forcing this system. So, essentially you are giving some input to this system which is resulting in a response or an output, and that is the working of the climatic system. So, a forcing or an input is, suppose the amount of energy that is given out by the sun, if it increases, so this climatic system would give out a response. So, that response might be that you will have a more hotter climate in any particular region, or it might result in a situation where the snowfall decreases in an area, or maybe the biotic components change. So, there is a lot of mortality of plants. So, all of these would be known as responses of the climatic system to the external forcing. Now, what are the forcings? Forcings is what are the inputs that you are giving to the climate system because of which it might give out a response. So, forcings can be changes in the plate tectonics, so that is an internal forcing, or changes in the earth's orbit, or changes in the sun's strength, or the anthropogenic forcing. Now, when we say anthropogenic forcing, anthropos is man, genic it means that caused because of or formed out of. So, it is a forcing that is formed out of human beings, and a good example is that of release of the greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane. So, if the concentration of carbon dioxide increases, so that is acting as a forcing on the climatic system, it is retaining more and more amount of heat in the climatic system, and that is resulting in some responses. When we talk about responses, here are some responses. We have 5 components of the climatic system, and changes in any of these would be called a response. So, changes in atmosphere, suppose the wind direction changes, the wind speed changes, that would be called a change in the atmosphere, or changes in the oceans, or changes in vegetation, or changes in land structure. So, probably because of climate change, the or changes in the ice cover. So, when we talk about all these changes, probably because of climate change, the ice cover would melt, which would increase the water level in the oceans, which would then reduce the amount of surface that is covered by land, because the lands will get inundated, which would also result in changes in the vegetation, because a number of plants would get submerged and a number of plants will die out, and also changes in the atmosphere, because you will have changes in the wind direction, you will have changes in rainfall patterns. So, some areas will get more rainfall, some areas will get less rainfall, which would then again influence the vegetation of those areas. So, some species will die out, some more species will come into this area. All of these are different responses that we can observe because of climate change, or because of any particular forcing that is given to the climatic system. So, these responses can be more winds, droughts, floods, increased temperature, forest fires, changes in the snow cover, and so on. Now, these are the physical responses that we can see, but the climate change will also result in a number of ecological responses and a number of biological responses. Now, what are those biological responses? So, we can observe changes in, say, the genetics of an area, because the natural selection will change. Because currently, if you have an area where you have a mean temperature of, say, 30 degrees. Now, if you increase that to, say, 32 degrees, so in the case of 30 degrees, certain individuals of the population are being selected because they are more fit. Now, if you increase the temperature, only those individuals that are able to tolerate this increase in temperature will be more selected. So, there will be a change in the natural selection that we will observe, which is a change in the genetics, or a change in the allele diversity, because it is possible that during this process, when you have a higher temperature, a number of individuals would die out, and that would result in a loss of some alleles that are already present there in the gene pool. So, that would be a genetic level change, or changes in the mutation rates, because when you have cells that are undergoing division, if there is a change in the ambient surroundings, if there is a higher temperature around, so it is possible that the enzymes might not function properly. In those situations, it is also possible that you will have some more errors that creep up whenever there is a replication of DNA. So, we might observe changes in the mutation rates, or we might even see changes in physiology. So, changes in physiology include things such as the birth rates, or the activity rates and rhythms of the organism. The birth rates might change because the organisms are already feeling a lot of stress. So, when there is an organism that is highly stressed, it might not want to give rise to the young ones, because it does not find the ambient conditions good enough to raise an offspring, or it might result in changes in the activity patterns of organisms. So, if there is an organism that is active during the daytime and it is too hot during the daytime, so this organism might stop or might prefer not to go out during the daytime. So, there would be a change in the activity patterns of the organism, or changes in disease susceptibility, because an increase in temperature will result in a lot of stress to the organisms. So, if an organism is already stressed, it is more susceptible to a disease, or changes in the survival rates of the organism, or we might see changes in the phenology of organisms. Now, phenology refers to the timing of organisms for different activities. So, for instance, we might see changes in migration patterns, migration timings. So, if there is a bird that wants to move to India during the summer season, and the summer seasons approach faster, so it might start coming in place of April, it might start coming in February. So, that would be a change in the phenology of the bird. And whenever there is a change in the phenology, that might also have some other consequences. So, for instance, if there is a bird that is coming in April and it is having access to food, if it comes in the month of February, then probably it does not have access to enough food, and then probably it might die out. So, in phenology we will say changes in migration, departure or arrival, or we see changes in budding or flowering of different plants, or changes in the growing season length, or hatching period, or fledging period, or dispersal period, or hibernation period. So, all of these are changes in phenology that we will observe, and all of these are biological responses to the climatic changes. Or we can see changes in the dynamics of different organisms. So, in the case of dynamics, we can see changes in the sex ratio of certain organisms. Now, organisms such as crocodiles have a temperature dependent sex determination, TSD. So, it is called temperature dependent sex determination. Now, what happens in this case is, if you have a higher temperature, so you have the eggs and the eggs are laid out, and if the eggs get a higher temperature, then in that situation you will have more number of males. So, the males would increase and the females would decrease in number. Whereas, in the case of animals such as the tortoises, we would see a very different impact. So, if you have a higher temperature, the number of males would reduce and the number of females would increase. Now, this thing is known as a temperature dependent sex determination. Now, if you increase the temperature, if there is global warming, so in the case of crocodiles, we will have a situation that there are too few number of females, and so the population might go towards a collapse. Or in the case of tortoises as well, we might see that there are enough number of females, but then there are not enough number of males to fertilize that population. So, there as well we will start observing changes in the population growth rate. So, these are changes in the dynamics. So, changes in the sex ratio, or changes in the age structure, or changes in the abundance are all what we will observe because of the changes in climate. Now, this might also result in changes in the distribution of organisms, because habitat quantity and quality will change. If there is an organism that requires a certain fodder species that grows in cooler climates, if the temperature rises, so this fodder species would die out and the habitat will not remain suitable for this particular species of animal. So, then it might have to move out, it might have to migrate out. Or we will see changes in the ecological niches, or in the range sizes of animals, or in the range localization of animals. Because here again we had observed in the case of, so we had observed that in one of the earlier lectures, if you have the amount of food that is given here, and if you have the range size, we see that if you have less amount of food, the animal tries to maintain a larger range size as compared to a situation where you have more amount of food. So, if there is more amount of food that is available, so you will observe that the animal has a reduced range size. Now, if you have a situation of climate change, and if the food species die out, if the plants die out, if the flowers have changed their seasons, so that the flowers are not providing enough amount of nectar or pollens to the animals, so then that would also result in a change in the range sizes. So, the ranges would increase in size. So, that is also another biological impact of climate change that we are observing, and all of these biological impacts will result in a change in the ecosystem dynamics of that area, or changes in interspecific relationships. So, we have situations such as dissynchronization, disequilibrium, uncoupling and new interactions. So, what we are referring to in this case is that, suppose you have a species, and in this species it lays eggs, in the month of February, and then the larvae come out in the month of say April. Now these larvae come out in the month of April because in the month of April you have say flowers that come up, and these flowers are then eaten up by the larvae. So these serve as the food source. Now in this case we are seeing an interspecific interaction. So this is an interspecific interaction. Interspecific because you have this one species which is the flowering plant, and you have this other species which is an insect. Now both of these species are showing this interaction in terms of predation, or maybe it could be some sort of mutualism. Now in the situation of climate change, so suppose this was also in April. Now if you have a situation of climate change, then probably because you have an increased temperature, in place of April this plant starts flowering in say March, and the flowers remain for say 15 days. Now what happens? When these flowers come up in the month of March, you do not have these insects around. Now these insects probably are feeding on these flowers and probably are also resulting in the pollination of these flowers. Now when it is responding to the climate change, it has changed its timing. So it, in place of flowering in April, it has started flowering in March, because the plants do not know when the larvae are coming out. They are only responding to the ambient temperatures. So probably there is one species that is responding to temperature, there is another species that is responding to the amount of daylight. Now in that case we will see this dissynchronization, because when these flowers come up in the month of March, there are no larvae around, so there is no amount of pollination, so these plants would start dying off. On the other hand, when these larvae come out in the month of April, there is no flower available for them, so there is no food available for them, and so these larvae also start dying out. So just because now both of these species individually they are not being decimated because of climate change, but then because the synchronization between both of these species that was there in the beginning, because that has been disrupted, one is now coming up earlier, the other one is coming up later. So because of this might result in a decimation of both the species, and this is what we mean by when we say a dissynchronization between these two species, or an uncoupling of these species, or probably there could be some new interactions that would come up. So in place of this particular species that was fertilizing these flowers, probably now there would be some other species that gives out its larvae in the month of March, and those species would now start interacting with these flowers, and we do not know what would be the impact of such new interactions, the uncoupling of earlier interactions and the starting of new interactions. What would be the impact of these on the ecosystem? Because these interrelationships that have come up, they have evolved through the millions of years of evolution, and if we change them in a very short period of time, in a period of say a few decades, then probably it might result in a negative influence on the ecosystem. The other biological impacts could be changes in the community productivity. So the amount of biomass that is being produced in the community, or the energy flux of the community, might also see a change. Now all of these will next result in ecosystem services disruption. So there would be a change in the composition, function and production functions of the ecosystem. So that would result in an ecosystem that is not able to perform its functions properly, which would then further result in changes in the biome integrity. So now we can observe that just because of a single change, just because of climate change, we can anticipate that there might be a number of changes in the ecosystems. Now this is a theoretical background. The question is, are these changes actually happening because of climate change? Or are these just a theoretical saying? Because we are just saying that because of these changes there would be a disruption in the ecosystem, but then are we acting a bit too prudent, or is it that we will not observe these large amounts of changes and we are just frightening ourselves? So, let us now look at some examples. The first example is that of phenological anomalies and the temperature anomalies. Now, in this graph, here we have on the x axis we have the years 1950, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75 and so on. Now, the blue color here, the dark blue color is showing you the temperature anomalies in the month of March, April and May. The blue color is the light blue color is showing you the temperature anomalies in the month of March and April, and the pink lines are showing you the spring arrival of birds. The red one is showing you the hatching in flycatchers, and as we can see, all of these curves come one upon the other. So, essentially there is a very good correlation between temperature anomalies and phenological anomalies. So, in fact, if there is an increase in temperature or if there is a decrease in temperature, that would result in a phenological change. So, this is something that we are actually observing in nature, and so when we say that climate change would result in phenological anomalies, we are not making a statement that is way out of proportion. This is something that we are already observing in nature. Or if you look at changes in the habitats. So, let us look at changes in different organisms when you change the ambient conditions. So, these are experimental results and a few field observations. So, on the x axis here you have the temperature, on the y axis here you have the amount of phytoplanktons. So, you have milligram of carbon per liter, and here you see that as the temperature increases, the phytoplanktons reduce. So, with increase in temperatures you will have less number of phytoplanktons that are available in the ecosystem. Now, phytoplanktons are producers. So, producers are required because they produce food for all the other organisms, and if the producers themselves reduce in their numbers, then the ecosystem is bound to get a change. Here we see the total biomass of the system that would reduce with an increase in the temperature. Here we are observing the zooplankton. So, zooplanktons increase in numbers. So, you have reduced food and more number of zooplanktons. So, what would happen to all of these zooplanktons? Well, they will start dying out in large numbers because they are present in large numbers, they do not have access to sufficient amount of food, so they will start dying off. Or if we look at the number of microbes that we have in the system. So, if we increase the temperature, the number of microorganisms would go up. Or if we look at the phytoplanktons, so this is phytoplankton and this is reducing, and this is now a field observation. Or if we look at different other species, so here we are looking at the larval duration of a particular species. How many days does this species remain in the larval state? And if we increase the temperature, so the number of days it remains as a larva, it reduces. The dispersal distance also reduces. The survival rate for this particular species, it increases when you have more temperature around. So, we are seeing changes in different components of the ecosystem. So, the changes in the habitat are not just theoretical changes, we can actually prove it through experimental observations, and we can actually prove it through the field observations. Other large scale changes are changes in the coral ecosystems. So, here we are observing all of these corals that have died out. So, this is a process that is known as the bleaching of corals. Now, in the process of bleaching, they lose out all their colors and they die out, and more corals are getting bleached, more and more corals are dying out because of the climate change. Now, when corals die out, it is not just the corals that will suffer the consequences, but a number of other species as well, because corals are keystone species here. They play a role in the ecosystem that is much greater than their own numerical abundance, because corals act as nurseries for a number of fish species. Now, if you do not have well functioning corals in this system, the fishes would also die out. And not just the corals are showing an impact, but also we are seeing that other major ecosystems and major keystone species in the ecosystem such as kelps are dying out. Now, when kelps die out, they are the habitat for a number of species, and when kelps die out, all of those species will also die out. Or things like mangroves. If mangroves are dying out, that would also result in the death of a number of species. And not just these biological changes are playing a role, but also the physical changes. So, in the case of the polar bear requires a sheet of ice to stand, to rest, to look for its prey and so on. Now, if you have a situation where you have a piece of ice here and a piece of ice here, so you have a polar bear that starts its journey here, it gets into the water, it maybe swims for a while and maybe it catches a few fishes and then it is able to get to this second ice and then it is able to rest for a while. What happens when you have a situation of climate change? So, if you have more amount of heat in the system, so these ice sheets are now shrinking in size. Now, in place of having these ice sheets that are close by, you have a situation in which you have an ice sheet here and maybe another ice sheet here. So, polar bears now gets into the water, it starts swimming to the other side, but then it is not a very good swimmer. After a while it will start losing its breath, after a while it will start getting tired, and when it is tired it is not getting another sheet of ice to stand, to rest. So, what will happen? The polar bear will drown at this stage. Now, these are the habitat level destructions that we are already observing. Changes in the corals, changes in the kelps, changes in the mangroves, changes in the physical habitats, ice sheets and so on. These are something that we are already observing in the system. Another thing that we are observing is a rise in the invasion of exotic species. So, in this picture we are seeing this green portion is the amount of invasion and the invasion is increasing all through the years. Now, why is that invasion increasing? Because every species, every member of the ecosystem has a certain range of conditions to which it is most suited. So, for instance, you had this earlier situation, you had this situation and this was the mean temperature. So, this is the temperature. Now, if you are shifting the temperature, so probably in place of this particular species, now the environment is more suitable for another species, and which is what we are seeing here. The original inhabitants of the forests are dying out and the invasive species are taking their place. The other kinds of ecological interactions that we can see is that suppose there is a species that exists in the larval form and in the adult form. Now, because of climate change, if there is a change in the transport processes, so basically what we had seen earlier, there is a larval form and the larval form does not remain for a very long period as a larval form, it converts into an adult very quickly. So, it is not able to disperse properly. So, the transport processes get altered, or if there is another physiological, morphological or behavioral changes. So, these are the direct impacts that we will observe in the ecosystems. Now, when that happens at the level of this species, we will start seeing changes in the community level as well. So, community level changes would be changes in the population size of the interacting species. So, if this species reduces in population, then probably the prey of this particular species would increase in their size, in their numbers, and those species that were dependent on this species for food, they would reduce in their numbers. So, we will start seeing changes in a number of species. Now, remember the process of trophic cascade. In the process of trophic cascade, we made changes at one single level of the ecosystem. So, in the case of Yellowstone National Park, we made changes by bringing in wolves into the ecosystem. Now, wolves are top predators. When we brought in wolves into this system, they started hunting deers. Deers started showing behavioral changes, they started moving from that area, and so the prey of the deer, which is the plants, they started growing up. Similarly, when these plants started growing up, we were seeing more number of berries in the system. So, bears started increasing in their numbers. They reinforced the role of the wolves in the case of the deers, but then the number of small species such as the rabbits, they started increasing in number, which resulted in an increase in the number of eagles that we had in the system. Now, just change in one trophic level can bring about so many changes. So, that is a trophic cascade. Now, a similar trophic cascade will be observed here if this particular species is say a predator species. So, their prey would start increasing in number and the next trophic level would then get decimated. So, we will start seeing changes in the populations and also start seeing changes in the per capita strength of different interactions. Now, these are all proximate responses and they will result in a number of emergent responses. Now, these emergent responses are changes in the distribution of animals, changes in the diversity of the ecosystem, changes in the productivity of the ecosystem and changes in the micro evolutionary processes that are going on in the system. So, when we say that climate change is having a small and gradual impact on some species, that might result in a very blown out response in the whole of the ecosystem. Similarly, in the case of other species such as plants, we saw this example before, that in the case of trees. So, here we were modeling the cheed pine trees that are there in the Almora district of Uttarakhand, and currently they peak in their carbon sequestration potentially at around 110 years, and with climate change it will move down to around 80 years. That is another big change, because that would also mean a change in the availability of food that is there in the ecosystem for different species. Now, apart from these changes, we will also start seeing changes in the health of different species or the amount of stresses that we will have in different species. Now, because of climate change, if there are thermal extremes, so we might start seeing more amount of heat strokes in different animals, or if there are weather disasters, if there is more amount of flooding, if there is more amount of drought, we might start seeing animals that start dying because of drowning, because of dehydration, or because of some other microbial organisms such as gastrointestinal diseases, because the microbes increase in their numbers if they get a warmer climate, or changes such as psychosocial trauma in different organisms. Now, climate change will also result in ecological changes, as we have just seen. Now, if there is an ecological change and if that results in changes in the food availability of an organism, that might start suffering from malnutrition or growth retardation or developmental delays, which would then further have impacts on some other species. Because of ecological changes, because of phenological changes, we might start seeing allergens in different times of the year. So, if there are more number of allergens, we will start seeing more allergies, for instance, or more amount of infectious diseases, or some more emerging infectious diseases, some new diseases that we have not seen so far. Another change that we will observe is that because every organism has a certain temperature range in which it feels the most comfortable, when we have changes, so we will see that in the current pattern of biogeography, we find that the number of organisms is maximum at this particular temperature range. Now, if we shift this temperature to some other temperature, then we might start seeing a reduction in the number of animals at that particular place, or maybe an increase in the number of animals in some other place. So, for instance, if this is the current species range of this particular species, and these are the local populations, and here this is south, this is north. Now, with increasing temperatures, this area has now become too warm for this species. So, both of these will die out, and probably these areas that were very cold for this species earlier, they now become habitable for these individuals. So, now they start up some new populations here. So, we will start local extinctions and cold edge range expansions, and this is not something that is theoretical, this is something that we are seeing in practice. And the extinctions that we will see in the cold edges, they have also been quantified, and we know now that with an increase in global warming, we will start seeing more number of extinctions. Now, when we talk about changes in the species range, this is also something that we are now observing in the field. So, for instance, in the case of a number of insect species that are living close to the mountains, if in the case of a mountain, we have a greater temperature here at the bottom, and we have a lower temperature as we move up. This is something that we call as the lapse rate in the case of geography. So, the bottom areas are warmer, the upper areas are colder. Now, if there is an insect species that prefers to live in the warmer climates, so currently it is living in these climates. Now, if the temperature goes up, so in place of having this orange region in the bottom and the blue region on the top, now everywhere it is orange to yellow region. So, in that case this species will now start coming up to a greater height than was earlier possible because of the biogeography of this species, or maybe because we will have more number of puddles, we will now start seeing an increase in the number of individuals that are getting born out of this species, and this is something that we are already seeing in nature. So, if we look at the vectorial capacity, which essentially tells you the efficiency of transmission of diseases because of the vectors, and here we are talking about Aedes aegypti, which is the mosquito that is responsible for diseases like dengue. Now, because of an increase in temperature, we are already seeing an increase in the vectorial capacity of these mosquitoes. Now, if you have an increase in the vectorial capacity of these mosquitoes, then more number of people would start dying of dengue, or maybe more number of animals would start dying of because of their own diseases, because their vectors are also increasing in the vectorial capacity. We might also start seeing changes in the allele frequencies, and this is also something that we have seen in nature. So, there is this particular species of owl which is known as tawny owl, and this species is present in two different colors. Now, when we are talking about these changes, it may help you to remember the case of the peppered moth. So, in the case of peppered moth, we saw that there is this moth which is present in two colors, the light color and the dark color. And in the pre-industrialization days, when the barks of the trees were covered in lichens, so the light colored moth was able to camouflage itself, and the dark colored moth was preferentially eaten. Now, when we had industrial revolution, so the lichens started dying out, the barks became more and more exposed, the barks became more and more darker, and so the dark colored moths were able to camouflage themselves much better, and in that case the lighter moths started dying out. And similarly, when with the passage of the Clean Air Acts, again we saw a reversal. Now, that was a change in the allele frequencies because of industrialization, and we are seeing a very similar change in the case of allele frequencies and changes because of the climate change. So, now this tawny owl, which is present in these two colors, the light color and the dark color, and it lives in those forests where these trees are covered with snow for a very long period of time. Now, when you have snow in the background, the lighter colored owl gets camouflaged very easily, and now when this owl needs to hunt small rodents, so the rodents are not able to see this owl, and so the lighter colored owls are able to hunt much more preferentially or much more easily as compared to the darker colored owls. So, essentially the fitness of the lighter colored owls is much greater. But then because of climate change, what we are observing is that there is less amount of snow on these trees. So, when there is less amount of snow on these trees, so the color or the background of the trees has now shifted from a lighter color to a darker color, the color of the foliage or the color of the bark or the color of the branches. So, when that happens, now these lighter colored owls are now very easily seen in the darker colored backgrounds, whereas the darker colored owls are now more camouflaged from their prey. So, then when this situation arises, then the fitness of this particular individual, it increases and this particular individual decreases. Why? Because now the prey of these owls are not able to see the darker owls, and we are actually observing that with time the frequency of the darker colored allele is now increasing in this population. So, when we are talking about the impacts of climate change on different ecosystems, on different populations, different communities, it is not just a theoretical construct, it is something that we are actually observing in the field and something that we can actually prove through experiments. Now, in the case of this tawny owl, this was a lucky species because it was already available in two colors. Now, probably if you have a situation in this where this owl was only present in, say, this lighter colored variant, if we did not have this darker colored variant, so in that case if climate change happened, it would not have anything to fall back to, and when all the individuals are easily spotted, so all of them would start dying off, because all of them would lose their fitness, they would not be able to hunt properly. So, we will also start seeing a number of extinctions in a number of species. Now, what can we do about it? We know that there is climate change that is happening. So, what can be our response as ecologists or as people who are working in the conservation sector? How can we help these ecosystems? How can we help these communities? So, there are two kinds of responses that we can put up. The first one is called mitigation, the second one is called adaptation. Now, climate change mitigation, so mitigation refers to a human intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. Now, because we know that these climate changes are happening because of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, if we can reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that would be called as a mitigation strategy. Now, how can you reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Well, there can be two ways. Again, as we talked in the case of bioaccumulation, in the case of bioaccumulation, you have some amount of toxins that are getting into the system, and then there are some amount of toxins that are getting out of the system. If the amount of input is greater than the amount of output, we will see accumulation. Now, similarly, in the case of greenhouse gases, we have the atmosphere. So, let us say that this is the atmosphere. Now, in the atmosphere, we are adding in carbon dioxide through a number of sources. Now, those sources could be your vehicles, those could be your industries, or probably those could be situations such as the mines, or maybe areas where your ores are getting processed. So, maybe ore processing. Now, all of these processes, or maybe say cement manufacturing, now all of these are adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But at the same time, there are also some other processes that are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What are those? We saw it in ecology. In the case of primary production, you have the trees that are taking out carbon dioxide in the process of photosynthesis. We have things such as the phytoplanktons. So, when we talk about mitigation, mitigation would say that let us reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is coming out from these sources. So, in the case of vehicles, you could go for a more efficient vehicle, or probably a vehicle that uses electricity in place of your gasoline. In the case of industries, you could look for processes that are much more efficient, so that they release less amount of carbon. In the case of mines and ore processing, probably you could shift to something else that releases lesser amount of carbon. In the case of cement manufacturing, you could go for a process that is more efficient, or probably you could try to replace cement with some other material that does not release so much amount of carbon dioxide. So, that is one way, that is to reduce the emissions. The other way is to increase the removal from the atmosphere. So, you can go and plant more number of trees. So, more number of trees there is more amount of removal from the atmosphere. Or in the case of phytoplanktons, we saw it in the lecture on primary productivity, that we have a number of oceans and seas that are deficient in iron. So, if you put in iron, so the number of phytoplanktons would increase, we will see more amount of phytoplanktons. So, probably iron seeding could be one other way of mitigating. Or for instance, you could go for things that are called as artificial trees. Now, artificial trees are devices that artificially take out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then they are able to fix it. Or you could go for situations in which you install equipment that takes out this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and probably puts it into a geological sink. So, you can create more sinks. So, all of these together will be known as the steps of mitigation, and all of these would require a lot of effort. So, for instance, if you want to replace say iron and steel with wood, because if you have more trees and you are taking this wood out, So, when you are taking this wood out, so you are fixing this carbon for at least that period of time till which you have this wood out that you are using. So, it is till it is burnt, so you are keeping that carbon fixed outside of the atmosphere. Now, if you want to use wood, you will have to reduce the cost of wood or probably come up with technologies that make the use of wood more attractive option as compared to that of iron and steel. So, more amount of technologies will have to be created, more amount of work will have to be done. Now, this is mitigation, and mitigation is difficult. So, the other way out is that of adaptation. Now, mitigation asks the question, how can we thwart climate change, how can we make sure that climate change does not happen, how do we reduce the rate of climate change. Adaptation says, okay, climate change is going to happen, what can we do about it, how can we adapt ourselves, or how can we adapt our ecosystems, or how can we adapt our communities. So, adaptation is adjustment in the natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli or their effects, which moderates harms or exploits the beneficial opportunities. So, in the case of adaptation, you would say that probably because of our modeling, we know that say Kanpur is going to receive less amount of rainfall. Now, if Kanpur is going to receive less amount of rainfall, what we will do? We will set up more number of dams, so that more amount of water gets accumulated here. We will probably set up more number of tanks, and in that way we will compensate for the reduced rainfall that we will observe in this region. Or probably we could go for things such as artificial cloud seeding, so that there is more rain from the clouds. So, these kinds of mechanisms would be called as adaptation strategies. So, to have more amount of water in an area, or for instance Kanpur is heating up, so let us install more number of ACs into this region, so that people are able to live properly. These kinds of measures are known as adaptation measures. And the question is not whether mitigation or adaptation, the question is, can we incorporate both the strategies together, and in a number of situations we will have to incorporate both the situations together, because adaptation can help, but it cannot help us completely. Mitigation can help us completely, but it will take a very long period. So, in the intervening period, so we need to go with mitigation, we need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we have in our atmosphere, but till we are able to reduce that, we have to go for the adaptation possibilities at the same time. So, what are the mitigation options and what are the adaptation options? So, mitigation options include reducing of emissions. So, you can set up laws, you can go for green energy alternatives, or you can go for RED mechanisms, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, because again the forests are storehouses of carbon. If you have a forest that is getting degraded, or a forest that is getting converted into some other land use, so all that carbon that was stored in the forest will get released back. So, you can try to work on reducing the emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So, that is about reducing the emissions, or you can create more number of sinks. Most sinks are artificial trees, or carbon sequestration in geological sites, or afforestation, or RED plus mechanisms. So, RED plus is in this case we go for conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. So, in this way we try to create more number of sinks, more amount of sinks for these for the carbon or the carbon dioxide that is present in the atmosphere. So, these are the mitigation options. Now, when we talk about adaptation, we can have different kinds of adaptation. We can have anticipatory or proactive adaptation, or a reactive adaptation. Now, proactive adaptation is an adaptation that we this is a step that we take before we are already in a soup. So, we know that this region is going to receive less rainfall in future. So, we already start our adaptation processes, we already start making more number of tanks in this area. That would be called as proactive adaptation. Reactive adaptation is in a situation that we have already started seeing less amount of rainfall. So, let us now at least make more tanks, so that any amount of water that falls into this area is now saved. That would be called as a reactive adaptation. Now, adaptation can also be spontaneous or planned in the case of policy making, or it can also be spontaneous where different people by themselves come up with different adaptation mechanisms, or it can be public or private kind of adaptation. So, it can be adaptation through a government scheme, or it can be an adaptation at the level of private individuals. And when we talk about adaptation, we also have to talk about the adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is the ability of a system to adjust to climate change, including climate variability and extremes, to moderate potential damages, to take advantage of opportunities, or to cope with the consequences. So, when we talk about adaptive capacity, what we are asking is, does the system, does an ecosystem have the wherewithal that it would be able to cope with climate change? Does it have the capacity to adapt? Or if we have a system that does not have a capacity to adapt, then probably it is going to be doomed in near future. Can we increase this capacity? So, when we talk about adaptation, here are the elements of adaptation. So, we begin by our observations. So, observations of climatic variables, non-climatic variables. From these observations, we come up with an assessment of the impacts and the vulnerability. Here again we are talking about vulnerability. So, when we talk about vulnerability, what are the ecosystems that are more vulnerable to climate change? What are more exposed to climate change and do not have the adaptive capacity? So, those are the ones for which we will have to make a planning. Once we have a planning, then we can move through the Deming cycle. So, from the plan you do an implementation of the plan. From there you move to the checking stage, in which you check about the effectiveness of that plan. From the checking stage you move back to the acting or the adjusting stage, and from there you can come up with more number of points about which observations need to be made. So, that is about the element of adaptation. So, what are the options available for us for adaptation? So, there are these options are divided into 3 categories: creating resistance to change, resilience to change, and response to change. Now, resistance to change says that you want to create systems that reduce the amount of impact that your climate change will bring. So, you want to create a situation that is able to resist the impacts of climate change, and things would be to reduce the effects of forest fires, to reduce the effects of insects, diseases through better protection, removal of invasive species, resistance breeding, in which case you breed for resistance in the tree species. So, you go for planting those particular individuals that have such traits as are better able to resist climate change. So, probably these are plants that require less amount of water, or probably these are plants that are better able to ward off diseases that would come because of the stresses and so on. The second option is to create a resilience to change. Resilience is the ability to bring back once you already have the climate change. So, resilience to change would be, say, creation of surplus seed banks or sperm banks. Now, this is something that we already saw in the case of ex-situ conservation. So, in this case you are creating a resilience because you are creating a seed bank. So, even if your ecosystems die out because of the climate change, you can use these seeds and you can bring the system back to normal again. Or you can go for intensive management during the establishment promotion of biodiversity rich ecosystems. So, this would also require a lot of intensive management. So, resistance to change, resilience to change. The third option is response to change. So, you assist natural adaptations and transitions, you assist migration to newer areas. So, essentially you have a species that was living in this area, and because of climate change it now needs to move more northwards. So, when we say that we are allowing this species to respond to change, we are taking these individuals and we are translocating them to the other area. So, that is enhancing the ability of the species to respond to change. So, we are assisting natural adaptations, we are assisting natural transitions, assisted migration to newer areas, increase in redundancy, manage for asynchrony. So, management for asynchrony would be if you have a case in which the fodder species is not able to synchronize with the life cycle of the organism, then probably you can go for giving an artificial fodder from outside to the system, to the organisms that are not able to get their food in time. So, that would be a management for asynchrony. Or establishment of neo-native forest considering the past spread, or promotion of connected landscapes, so that the organisms are able to move by themselves. And whenever we are talking about the adaptation options, it is also important to talk about the maladaptation. So, probably we also need to think about the situations in which we are trying to help the adaptation, but it backfires. Any changes in natural or human systems that inadvertently increase the vulnerability to climatic stimuli. An adaptation that does not succeed in reducing vulnerability, but increases it instead. So, it is an adaptation that does not work. So, in today's lecture we began by looking at the climatic system, the components of the climatic system, how they interact with each other, what is climate, what is climate change, and then we started looking at the impacts of this climate change on different organisms, on different habitats, on different ecosystems, and we looked at the proximate level changes, that is the changes that would come up in the ecosystem, and we also looked at the emergent changes that would also move up in the hierarchy. And then we also looked at the options that we have available with us to thwart the climatic changes. What are the options of climate change mitigation? What are the options of climate change adaptation? How do we go about saving our species, saving our ecosystems and our communities from the climate change? So, that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.